Okay, so my name is David Molinski, and I'm a Victoria-based consultant. I've got about 30 years of experience in the energy sector. I worked for government for about 17 years as an economist, starting in Manitoba and then moving to BC in 2000. And I left government in 2006. I was the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Oil and Gas Division in the Ministry of Energy and Mines, and had a lot of experience working on a lot of the programs that helped kickstart the big development phase of Northeast BC natural gas. I worked for about 7 years as a consultant in Victoria, and I did work with BC Hydro, First Nations on some renewable energy projects. I worked with Ron. I worked with a lot of people in this room, actually. And then in 2012, when Chevron entered the Kitimat LNG project, they were a client of mine, and they said, how would you like to get a real job and work on a really cool project? And that was just a fantastic opportunity. So I worked on Kitimat LNG until early last year. I retired from Chevron. I was a team lead for policy and external relations for Chevron Canada. So I spent probably 80% of my time working on Kitimat and then 20% working on the rest of Canada. But we had responsibility for all the policy work that we did, all the work we did with government on negotiating the project moving forward, all of the Indigenous engagement related to the project, and that included the upstream in the Fort Nelson area, the Pacific Trail Pipeline, and the Kitimat LNG project. And you know, a couple of things, I had an opportunity to see the impacts of a big project like this starting to help communities. And I've seen the real change that happens when responsible resource development comes to a community and people have an opportunity to experience things in their lives that they never had an opportunity to work on. And I really saw lives getting changed. And the work that we're doing here is just so important. It's important for the province, it's important for the communities, it's important for Canada. And there's a chance to get it right. So this is just a fantastic opportunity. I really applaud the work of the First Nation communities that have come together to develop this. So I'm here. I was asked by the BCLNGA Alliance, and I've got quite a bit of experience with the Alliance. They're a great organization. I was the chair of the policy committee for 5 years and was involved in a lot of the discussions on key policy issues with the provincial government and had a lot of experience there. And they asked me if I could put together a presentation on competitiveness of the LNG sector in British Columbia. So I'm going to take you through a bunch of slides about the global energy demand and supply context, and Rob talked a bit about that. I'm going to get into a bit of a deeper dive on competitiveness itself, and then talk about the electrification of LNG. And don't hesitate to ask any questions. You know, more than happy to talk about my experiences working in the industry, and then also speaking independently about a project that you're sort of thinking about here. Rob covered off a lot of this. This is from the BP. There's lots of really great work done about energy forecasting. This is from the BP forecast. They do a really good job. Shell does a good job. IEA does a good job. So I think one of the things that they're all consistent about is we're going to need more energy, no matter what the scenario that you're looking at. And BP has this 2017 on the far left of that chart, and then the next bar is their most likely scenario, which is evolving transition, where, as Rob said, more natural gas, more renewables, and you start seeing that CO2 curve getting bent down from that changeover, moving away from oil and coal. Okay, so yes, there is an opportunity to reduce emissions from energy development. It's not necessarily static. As countries become more wealthy, they want to consume more energy for being able to do the same things that we do here. People start buying washing machines, they start buying cars, you know, all those sort of things that we think of as normal items here. A lot of people around the world are excited to get an opportunity for that development in their countries. So the energy intensity, though, becomes greater, which means we tend to get more out of the energy that we're consuming, and that's where we can start to look at bending that CO2 emission curve. Rob really covered this off, so I'm not going to do this again, but more renewables and more natural gas. Here's another picture of that supply gap, and Rob covered that off, so I'm not going to go through that again, but it's well recognized that by the late 2020s, there'll be a gap of LNG supply to meet the demand that's out there. So there's going to be an opportunity for new projects to get developed to help meet that. Now, so what's been happening over the last number of years has been a huge increase in the production of LNG from the United States, who are our key competitor here in Canada. And I think all of you have heard about the change in the United States becoming an energy exporter now. You know, since World War II, the United States has been a net importer of energy, but that turned around with the shale gas revolution and the shale oil revolution. They're now a net exporter of oil, and now they've become a major exporter of LNG globally as well. And this chart shows the projects that have been approved in the US since 2016. And you can see that there's about 10 plus million tons of LNG that by 2021, that will be the total amount of export capacity that's been developed in the Gulf of Mexico. I've put a line in there that shows what BC's entire natural gas production is, which is about 4.5 billion cubic feet a day of gas. So the BC, or the US export is about 2 BCs of natural gas production, and that's happened since 2016. So I started working on the Kitimat project in 2012, and in the time that we've been talking about, geez, it'd be really great to develop LNG here, 7 projects with 2 British Columbia's worth of natural gas have been developed in the US. So that's our competition. And there's more. This map shows the list of projects that are approved and under construction. So there's another 8 projects that are under construction right now. And then there's a long queue of other projects that have been approved and may or may not be built, but there's a potential that they will. So there's a lot of new development in the US. So the way that the industry, the way that projects get developed, and this isn't just for LNG, this happens on the renewable side, it happens in most resource sectors. This graph or this chart shows all of the different supply regions in the world. And we've highlighted Canada and the United States in this. This is from ARC, which is a Calgary-based energy consulting firm. They're really fantastic. And what you see is on the far right-hand side, that's the lowest cost supplier in the market, and that's Qatar. And then as you move up the curve from the right to the left, that's the supply that's becoming more and more expensive. And what happens is the cheapest product gets developed first. That attracts the investment dollars. And that goes to the comments on the buyers in Asia. They like a clean product, but it's got to be affordable for them. And when they've got options to buy from other suppliers, it's very competitive. And you can understand it when if you're out looking for something, if you're out buying gas for your car, you're looking for the cheapest gas station in town. You're not looking for the best, most expensive gas station necessarily. So the good news on this slide is that Canada and the US are pretty close in terms of the cost. And there's a lot of assumptions in here, and you can find lots of charts that show Canada's a little behind or Canada's a little ahead. But roughly we're in a similar ballpark between the two. Rob, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Maybe I would suggest the shading on the top is transportation or shipping costs. So depends on where the LNG is going to. So in this chart, and this is ARC Resource, no, which?
ARC Energy.
ARC Energy. This is their version. And so if you look at the United States, that would probably assume transportation to Asia.
So it's cost to Japan.
Or is it? Yeah, okay, there it is, all the way around. So it's a larger shipping cost, whereas Canada has a shipping advantage.
Yeah.
But we do know that all the projects that have been built in the US, a lot of them are shipping to Europe. So they're
Yeah.
going across the Atlantic and shipping the other way with a significant less shipping costs. So it's about where those projects are in time, where their product's gonna go. But so if you look at the dark bars on this chart, you'll see, okay, again, David's point is, hey, it's not so different, but you'll see United States slightly less than Canada on the dark bars, the dark blue versus the dark red, and the stuff above it was shipping.
Yeah. The reason why it's more expensive to go from the Gulf of Mexico to Asia is because they have to go through the Panama Canal. And that's a pretty expensive transit to go through there, particularly in time. And there's a fee that you have to pay to go through there. But now some very smart financial wizards have come up with doing essentially a virtual trade of LNG between a tanker that's sitting in the Gulf of Mexico and one that's sitting on the other side in the Pacific Ocean, and they do a trade back and forth of their product, and now they've eliminated physically having to move through the Gulf. So, you know, there's ways to arbitrage out costs in the system and be able to bring those down and be more competitive. This is a piece of work that the BCLNGA Alliance acquired. They went to an organization called IHS and asked to compare the competitiveness of BC. This is post the LNG Canada announcement, and there was a number of fiscal changes and some infrastructure investments that were made as part of that announcement. So we asked the BCLNGA Alliance asked them to do an analysis comparing BC with other supply options for our competition and see what it looks like. So you can see on this chart, I hope you can read it from where you are, but the BC projects are on the far right-hand side from right about here, where it's $9.40. What are we using here?
The sixth project over.
Sixth project over, yeah.
Sixth
So,
over.
so on the left-hand side, the fourth bar and the fifth bar are U.S. Gulf Coast projects. And just like in Canada, there's some projects that are more expensive and some that are less expensive. What you would expect to see is that these lower cost Gulf of Mexico projects are going to be going first. Once those are out of the way and people are looking for new product, then the higher cost Gulf of Mexico projects would be competing with the BC projects. So you know, that's where we are sort of in that competitive landscape between the two jurisdictions. Yep.
What's the market paying for gas right now?
The market paying for gas? About $1 on the spot market. You have to take a step back from the idea of looking at spot market prices. And I know that I've seen some articles written that, well, the price of LNG is, you know, $3 right now and all these projects are underwater. But companies are making projects based on a 40-year time horizon within the project itself and long-term contracts to supply LNG. So although a spot price may be very low for a bunch of fundamental supply and demand situations, right now there's a lot of supply from new projects hitting the market, and that's all looking for buyers. You know, once we start cleaning that up and we start moving to more of a balanced supply market, that price is going to drift up. So you know, you have to look at the long-term pricing of contracts that would underpin a project. And one advantage that we do have in Canada is that the cost of gas at our major trading hub, which is in Alberta, it's called AECO, is actually discounted from what the price is in the US. So the price of gas is cheaper in Canada. That helps with the economics of the project. We have the shorter transportation route, the gray bar at the top. You can see all the BC projects. That's a much smaller slice. But the cost of liquefaction in Canada tends to be a bit higher than the US. And what else? And then the pipeline, you have to build a 500+ kilometer pipeline to get your gas to Tidewater here, which you don't have to do in the Gulf Coast. Okay, so there's a number of structural features and structural challenges related to Canada versus particularly the US. So the features, we have abundant low-cost natural gas supply. We have got an enormous amount of gas in Western Canada. We'll never run out. We have the shorter shipping timeline to get to the Asian markets. We have government support and both the provincial and federal level. There is no doubt the governments want to see LNG happen. The support for the LNG Canada project has been, that government support is really what helped get it over the finish line. And the support by Indigenous communities and local communities has been fantastic. We've seen that support across northern BC, not just in the Indigenous communities, but in northeast BC as well. Fort St. John was very upfront in helping to promote this. And the Canadian brand is clean LNG through the value chain. That's a very attractive feature. We've got some challenges though. This week, I don't have to emphasize too much that regulatory uncertainty is a really significant issue in being able to attract projects into Canada. I can tell you from my experience with Chevron, there were people coming in from around the world to work on the project that had worked on LNG projects all over the world, and they found it really challenging in terms of the regulatory environment here, and that just adds a more of a significant cost burden on a project. We have unique costs that have to be recognized. We have the carbon tax, we have PST, we have property taxes, and we have a remote construction environment, and that makes it really challenging to build projects. So what does it look like to invest in an LNG project? These are really big projects. These are among the largest capital projects in the world. You're looking at making a $40 billion commitment when you're undertaking an LNG project. A company will invest billions of dollars up front, even before they release a final investment decision that they confirm they want to go ahead with the project. There's EAs. There's a lot of work you have to do at the front end of a project to start understanding the site that you're working on. You want to start some early construction to be able to help manage some of your risk. You're going to be spending billions of dollars. The project then goes into the construction phase, and that's when the real spending starts. And you will be spending tens of billions of dollars at that point, and that's going to be about the first 5 years. And once your project is up and running, then you start selling your LNG product, and you can start earning revenue in the project and start paying it back. A typical LNG project, major, global size LNG project, let's say 2 trains, like the LNG Canada project, you're looking at about 20 years before you actually earn the initial investment back and you start earning a profit on the project. And that's an extremely long period of time. And during this whole time, of course, government is generating a lot of revenue from these projects. Typically, on a big LNG project in Canada, the provincial government is the largest benefactor from the project in terms of the royalties on the gas, the various taxes in both the upstream and the LNG side of it. Next comes the government of Canada through the corporate taxes, and then comes the LNG proponents, usually about third in line in terms of earning revenue from the project. So that makes it very challenging. A lot can happen over those 20 years. And when you're looking at comparing a project in BC versus the Gulf Coast, I put together this table to sort of show you the comparison of what a project proponent is facing if they're choosing to go with BC, Northwest BC versus the Gulf of Mexico. So on the workforce, you're flying people in and flying people out, and you have camps. On the Gulf Coast, people drive from home to the work site to build an LNG project. On the natural gas supply, in BC, you're building a 500+ kilometer pipeline over 2 mountain chains, depending where you are, to be able to get to the coast. In the Gulf of Mexico, there's a very robust pipeline network that runs right past the plant gate typically. Then all you have to do is put in a tie-in right there. On the electricity side, a lot of discussion this morning about the electricity supply. So it's the single 500 kV line right now from Prince George. Down in the Gulf Coast, very robust electrical grid right there, running right past your plant gate. Logistics and transportation, it's all new build in BC. in the Gulf Coast. Houston is one of the major oil and gas hubs around the world. All of that infrastructure to support the development of a major project is sitting right there. The construction environment, it's seasonal in British Columbia, and in the Gulf of Mexico, it's year-round construction, minus time out for hurricanes every now and then, of course. What that leads to on a project is a lot of unknowns when you're looking at building a project in BC. And typically you have to build project contingencies, so things we didn't plan on when we started this project. And for projects in BC, you're looking at a project contingency of about 15%. That is a lot to have to put aside for things we don't even know that are going to happen on this project. And it's been known that these project contingencies in lots of other big capital projects in this part of the world, that's not enough. In the Gulf Coast, you're looking at about a 5% contingency fee. So it costs a lot of money to put money in contingencies, so that's a major cost disadvantage as well. On the fiscal side, we have the carbon tax, we have PST. Projects are still paying PST. It's deferred over a period of time, but the cost of PST is still there. And then there's property taxes as well. Compared to the Gulf Coast, no carbon tax, there's no PST, and municipalities, local governments are giving incentives to LNG proponents to build their projects. So when you stack up these elements side by side, you can see the challenge of making a project in BC work.
Sorry, one comment. The other difference between BC and US Gulf Coast is in the US Gulf Coast, lots of the projects, they are brownfield.
Yeah,
i.e. they
good
are,
point.
It's a conversion from a regas terminal to an LNG plant. So, but in BC, it's all greenfield. So.
Yeah, for those people on the phone, a lot of the Gulf Coast projects have been brownfield, which they were previously LNG import facilities, and they're converting them to export. But a lot of those are used up now, is my understanding. So those higher cost Gulf of Mexico projects on that previous slide, those ones were greenfield projects most likely. And the costs are starting to go up. So you've made a decision to go ahead with your LNG project. There's a very significant number of risks that you're facing during the entire project life. So you've got the construction risks, and that would be that the project is more expensive than planned. And there's certainly a number of LNG projects around the world that have, let's say, not kept within budget or time frame. You can look online. The Chevron Gorgon project in Australia is pretty famous for some cost overruns on a project like that. There's facility risks. So once you turn your LNG facility on, there's a potential that it doesn't operate as efficiently as you thought it would, or that you experience a lot of breakdowns. And a lot of these LNG facilities are a serial number one. They are designed for this particular space that you've decided to build your project. They're all unique. And because of that, it's sometimes challenging to get them to actually operate as intended. And that greatly affects the economics of a project. You have market risks, so the expected demand or price is less than you thought you would be able to get, or you've got another low-cost supplier entering the market and undercutting you. And then you have the economic risks, the recessions, interest rates, currency, all those sort of things that can happen. And over a 40-year period of time, they will happen. I mean, we've all experienced that in our lives. We've got government where there can be policy changes, and that can have an impact, and then other major interruptions. So the list of risks that a company is trying to manage is incredibly long. And I can tell you from my experience of working on an LNG project, the entire effort is an effort in risk management. And the ability to manage risks is the difference between having a successful project and having a major problem on your hands. Okay, so GHG intensity. So we've talked about this a bunch already today. So this chart here shows what the global average is. So the global average, when LNG projects were first being built like 15 years ago or so, they were not or they weren't very efficient at that time. All of them are using natural gas drives, and the energy intensity was about 0.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of LNG. So a bunch of the older projects that are still operating are producing at about that level. Delphi did a project with BC to identify the best in class of LNG, and the BCLNGA Alliance participated in that as well. And about 0.23, 0.24 was identified as that's about best in class globally right now for projects being built right now. And that's what BC sent its, set its full carbon tax benchmark at. BC said, your LNG plant must be at least this clean. This is the minimum performance that's required. And then as was described, they'd like everyone to be down to 0.16 as a minimum benchmark. And that way you can earn back your carbon taxes down to $30. And that's what they really set the target for projects to operate at. 100% electric plant will produce about 0.05 tons per ton of GHGs for the project. So you can't get it down to zero. There's some process gas that is used during the liquefaction process. And so that's about as low as you're going to be able to get that's out there. So when we're talking about net zero, you have to do something to accommodate that 0.05. The likelihood of having carbon capture and storage on the coast is very unlikely. There's nowhere to put. There's no sedimentary basins or other places to really put the carbon. So offsets would be a key way to be able to do that. But for let's say a project that's producing 18 million tons of LNG a year, the cost at $30 a ton would be about $27–28 million a year that would have to be picked up by somebody to bring you down to zero. And that's if an offset is allowed to be used for a project like this. And I did want to note, this would be the cleanest LNG by far in the world. Nobody would be able to come close to it unless there was an electric facility. And the reason why you probably won't see anyone actually coming close to this is because nobody has a grid like BC Hydro in terms of a clean grid. That is in the LNG business. Qatar, there's no hydroelectricity there. In the Gulf of Mexico, they're not using clean power. There's some renewables going into the Texas grid, but BC is very unique. We have something very special here, and I think highlighting what Steve said, this is a natural advantage that we have and a legacy that can be used to produce a really high quality, low carbon product. So a couple of slides on electrification, and then I will turn it over to questions. So this is a really complex question, and for those of you who don't know, Chevron actually recently proposed a EA amendment converting the Kitimat LNG project into 100% electric, and I was involved in all of the process to be able to get to that decision. And I can tell you it's a difficult decision for a major corporation to go with electrification. There is not any experience around the world running a major size LNG facility on 100% electricity. There's the one in Norway, the Snøhvit, but they have a natural gas electricity generating station sitting right outside of the plant gate. There is no project connected to a 500 kilometer single radial 500 kV line out there. So there is no experience globally. And when a major company is looking at this, there's a lot of red flags about the various risks. As I said, like the project like this is all about risk management. Huge amount of risks that you're trying to manage to be able to get to that decision to go with the electrification. There's a lot of experience using natural gas out there. Everybody knows how to do it. There's a very long list of projects that are using 100% natural gas, and so there's a lot of experience. So, companies that are risk averse, they want to default to something that they understand. So, it's a challenge getting to that decision to go with electrification. But I can tell you that from Chevron's perspective, making that decision to go with electrification was confirmation that this is the right way to go ahead with development. So companies are understanding that now, that producing a product that is cleaner, that's done more responsibly, is the right way to develop projects going forward. There's a lot of very significant technical questions. So the supply availability, will the power be there? Keith did a great presentation this morning on those questions, so I'm not going to reiterate that. But LNG facilities require the highest level of reliability. A microsecond of interruption can shut down an entire project for more than 24 hours to be able to get it to restart. And that's going to cost you cargoes, and that really harms the economics of a project. BC Hydro doesn't take liability for service interruptions. It's in the legislation. They're not responsible if the power goes out. So for a company developing an LNG project, and their choice is we can connect to BC Hydro or we can self-generate, and we can take the risk if the power's not there, that gets a lot more attractive. So it's very challenging to be able to hand that risk over to somebody else to manage. And then the cost of electricity versus natural gas. We've had a bunch of discussion today about the cost today of all in of being fairly even, but the bigger challenge is actually what are the electricity prices going to be in the future? And that's a bit hard to predict. BC Hydro has, of course, some big deferral accounts. It has to make, as we saw today, a lot of investments into its system to be able to supply more energy for the province. It's not just LNG that we're talking about electrifying. The BC Clean BC plan wants to electrify as much as it can across the province. So BC Hydro isn't going to be building capacity and transmission just to supply LNG. There's a whole vehicle fleet that the government would love to see turn over to be running on electricity. Buildings, you name it, we're hoping to electrify everything. That's going to have a big impact on rates. And for a LNG company, being able to lock down that electricity rate is something critical. The alternative is we are awash in natural gas. So it's very easy to make the decision, we'll just use our own gas to produce electricity. And that's the calculation that people are trying to understand. We talked already about buyers not paying a premium for clean LNG. So I think that we've already got that point a few times, but it can help differentiate BC supply. Maybe in time, that may be an opportunity, but today it's not. So there's a need for government to recognize the additional risks associated with electrification and LNG. So I think we touched upon this earlier. The publicly owned transmission system needs to meet the supply and reliability requirements. So anticipating that LNG proponents are able to cover that transmission cost makes it really, really challenging for a project. And I think when you look at those cost structures, it's razor thin in the competitiveness, and having to absorb a giant bill for the transmission upgrades would push a project into not being competitive. The price certainty on electricity rates, that's another key thing if you're thinking about what government needs to think about. Being able to lock down some prices and be able to get certainty so that projects can plan appropriately is going to be important. And then we talked about this a lot yesterday, the ability to earn and market offsets for performance that goes beyond the BC benchmark. So when we had the, there it is, the bar here at the 0.16, if you're an all-electric facility, you don't get any extra benefit by taking it down from 0.16 to 0.05. So from 0.23 to 0.16, you got $20 a ton reduction. Right now, you're not able to earn any reductions beyond the 0.16. So there's no incentive to go that extra mile, or there's no benefit coming from taking on all of those risks I talked about and getting yourself down to the absolute minimum emissions for a project. And either rebating the carbon tax further or providing offsets would be really beneficial to help manage those carbon costs in the system. And
Is that, David, has that just not been thought about, or is that a policy decision that's in place?
that was a policy decision. The previous climate, I forget the exact term for it, the climate plan for LNG enabled companies to earn offsets. And there was a proposal that there was an assumption that there was going to be multiple LNG projects, and that a clean project would be able to market its offsets to another LNG project that wasn't clean. So it was a complicated mechanism set up that not sure it would have been able to operate in reality unless you have multiple LNG projects. But when the new policy came in, this is the way it was shaped, that there was no more offsets allowed in the system. So the actual regulations hadn't been developed on the previous system, so we don't know exactly how it would have worked, but currently there's no ability to market offsets.
Same with the upstream.
Pardon me?
Same with the upstream.
And same in the upstream.
And that was an intentional decision, not just something that they had
Yeah.
in their minds.
Yeah, that's the policy. Yeah.
It was a very specific intention, which we did not like.
So, any questions or comments? Alex?
So, well, you can repeat the question. In the face of all that, why did Chevron decide to go fully electric?
Because I'm not speaking for them, but Chevron really recognized that it's the right way to go for a project.
Right way for what?
To be able to develop a project and manage the risks, that choosing to go electric was, given the climate we have and the policy direction in Canada, choosing not to go electric doesn't really seem like an option anymore. So you need to be able to get your projects down. As I forget who it was presenting on the BC plan. The BC plan includes LNG Canada's project. It's within that envelope. And BC has said, this is it. This is all of the room for emissions that we have in here, and you need to fit within this. So if you want to have a project, you have to fit within the BC Clean Plan, the Clean BC Plan. And if you want to manage your risk, you fit within that plan.
We have to acknowledge though that Chevron walked away from that too, right?
Chevron's looking for a buyer for the project.
But to be really precise, they wrote it down.
You wrote it down.
So that's, I mean, they've attributed $0 value on their books, right?
Yeah, I can't comment on that specifically. I was actually out of Chevron when that happened. I left in 2019. So, that decision, and I certainly can't speak for them. What I can tell you is that it's a very attractive project. If you go look at the project information on the EAO's website and the Canadian federal websites, the project has been fundamentally redesigned. It's all electric now. It's a very attractive project for a lot of reasons. And I'm hopeful that somebody will be interested in acquiring it.
Maybe just on that point, and I'm not privy to any of the Chevron information, other than as a large developer, a company that has multiple opportunities around the world, which is what Chevron does. They say, yeah, it looks good, but we have this risk. Oh, we have a risk, regulatory risk, because we're going to have to hit all these carbon requirements. Oh, we got a schedule risk. We're going to need to tie into the BC hydro grid, bring it on a single strand all the way across 2 mountains. So they build in those into the decision. They look in their portfolio of opportunities and they say, yeah, it's a good project, but look at all these risks. We're actually going to put our money over here where we don't have all those risks. And that's likely what's happened. It was a good project, but there are other better projects for them in their portfolio that aren't facing those risks.
So other potential companies will think the same thing.
Possibly. Now,
Possibly
there
or
might
not
be some-
necessarily,
There might be
yeah.
a company that doesn't have all those opportunities and say, hey, I really want to buy that Chevron piece, so that may happen.
Yeah, I can
But the LNG club is a very good point, because it is very big companies.
yeah.
It tends to be the global players that do have those opportunities all around the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to Rob's comment, there are many, and all companies in the energy business have multiple opportunities to invest around the world. And they're trying to find the projects that give them the best return that fits in with their portfolio of projects. So, yeah, I mean, you've seen in BC lots of proponents coming in and exiting projects. Like, that's actually a normal part of the way these things get developed. And you see this in other sectors, the mining sector, the forestry sector. It's actually not unique to see this happen on projects, and projects may slow down and then speed up, you know, so it's hard to predict. What is certain is that the projects that are competitive are the ones that will rise to the top, and those are the ones that will attract the investment. So competitiveness is absolutely critical, and you know, you can't justify it alone on you know, we're the cleanest, we look like the best place to invest. You have, the numbers have to work for the people that are making the investments. They have responsibilities to their shareholders, and you know, ultimately, having a good project that's responsibly developed and being competitive, that makes you really good in the marketplace, and that's what you want to have.
So another question, or you interrupted me. So if you implemented the 6 things that Steve Carr suggested, how would that change the circumstance for a project like that?
All of those, so when you're looking at a project, as I said, you've got like this laundry list of risks that you're trying to manage. And you're literally going down the list and you're trying to check every single one of them off. And when you've checked them off as much as you can that you're comfortable with, then a project can then usually move forward. So all of those things help reduce that risk on the project. And so when you look at the LNG Canada project, having that alignment between the government, the Indigenous communities, and a lot of people in BC, that was fundamental to it being able to move forward. None of these projects happen just because a company feels like making an investment. It takes a collective effort. It takes a collective effort of the company, the government, you know, the communities to be able to make them work. None of these projects, and when you look at any big projects in BC, the Rio Tinto redesign, you know, any of the big projects, it's a collective effort on all of them. And the ones that go forward, the companies recognize that, and they are more than happy to be able to do things that help reduce risk. It may increase their costs a bit, but if it helps reduce risk, they're happy to work with the government and the communities, as long as there's some trade-off on the other side to help accommodate those things. Linda.
So Steve's numbers are a little bit different from yours on the competitiveness. Is that just because they're newer on the cost?
This? I don't recall his numbers.
There was a 46% differential with the US running with them?
It depends what you're comparing, and we're probably comparing different
Different
studies. Everybody does, you know, slightly different methodology, and it really comes down to what are your assumptions in your study. They're slightly different, but they're still pointing in the same direction. Like, we're not coming to different conclusions. You know, the discussion we're having is how big is the gap,
Right.
not is there a gap.
Steve might have been just talking about facilities, I'm trying to remember what
He was-
Facility costs.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the product on product
Product
comparison.
on product comparison, right?
Yeah.
Well, the top number along these bars is the final delivered cost. So you can see the US Gulf Coast.
34% heat.
Yeah, the super cheap US Gulf Coast is 827 here, and then you're getting into, you know, the cheapest BC is 940. So yeah, that's 30%.
Yeah, okay.
Isn't there also a risk that the Gulf Coast could become more competitive? I mean,
Yeah.
if customers are that price sensitive to the price of gas, could they lower their price, given that they have a head start on production?
Sorry, who could lower their price? The
Gulf.
US?
Gulf Coast.
Yeah, yeah. Every project, I mean, when you're looking at the cheapest Gulf Coast projects, yeah, they're going to be able to undercut BC all day long. It's only when those less expensive projects are built out and supplying the market, and then the market's looking for a new supply, that's the point where they're going to say, should we get it from the Gulf Coast or should we get it from BC? And that's when, you know, the competition is on.
At the same time, so in the US Gulf Coast, the big projects have been in Corpus Christi and in Sabine Pass. And Sabine Pass, Louisiana, they built 5 trains in the time we permitted one up here. But they were building at an LNG import terminal. So the US had built these import terminals for gas when they thought they were going to be short. And so those facilities that were, I've forgotten your name, being referred to as brownfield sites because they already have a marine terminal with tanks and everything there. So those facilities are the ones that are getting built out. They already have, call it a quarter or a third of the infrastructure there. The big marine terminals, the tanks, the rail cars, the power, it's all there. So those are cheap. And that's why they're undercutting this by 34 to 40% on the facility costs. But the next round, once they're used up, those sites, now they've got to develop greenfield sites, all new ports, all new infrastructure. And so that's when it starts to get closer, like the bars that you saw in that arc chart where they really showed them
Yeah, I
coming
mean,
closer.
some of the greenfield, they are even cheaper than Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi.
Exactly, they are still cheaper, but they're getting closer, I guess is my
Yeah.
point, versus a 30% gap, which is what we've
Yeah.
seen in the first big tranche of LNG in the US.
Yeah.
Okay,